What's up, everybody? Welcome back to The Contrarian. Today I will be talking about the coming economic chaos that is very likely if China does in fact invade Taiwan, which it's looking increasingly likely that they are moving towards doing that. Today I'll be covering a lot of this recent progress with China moving troops, missiles, and tanks in enormous quantities to the Fujian province, which is the province directly opposite the island of Taiwan. Also, the Chinese Navy is supposedly conducting what is only an exercise, but they are in fact actually performing this, what they're saying is an exercise, entirely surrounding Taiwan right now. So they mean business, and likely it's another sort of Russia-Ukraine story where they continue amassing troops and weapons along the Taiwan border, the Taiwanese Strait, and out in the Pacific Ocean. And eventually they do in fact invade Taiwan. Unfortunately, I obviously hope that none of this happens, but it's looking increasingly like it does. So this will cause a lot more economic chaos than any of the Russia-Ukraine situation did, especially for the United States. The US was somewhat separated from the Russia-Ukraine story, but this will definitely draw the United States in significantly more. Not only are we dependent on China for significantly more goods that we import from them, but we're also a ally with Taiwan, and so this unfortunately will likely draw the United States in a much larger way than even we have been involved with Ukraine. So first of all, just addressing some of the noise out there currently right now, Biden is supposedly telling Pelosi, or he was supposedly telling Pelosi that going to Taiwan was a bad idea. Pelosi, what is she really doing at this point? In my opinion, she's likely just running for cover. She's likely using this as a way of saying, you know, oh, I really did support the people of Taiwan. I only say this because for the last decade, multiple decades, she's been a very good asset for the CCP. She's been a very useful idiot at best for the US and a traitor at worst, along with a bunch of other career politicians. It goes across the board: Mitch McConnell, Mitt Romney, Pelosi, the Bidens, of course. So it goes across the board. There's a lot of useful idiots, if not outright traitors, in our own government. So all that being said, that just does address the noise out there. The CCP supposedly threatening to shoot down Pelosi's plane, in my opinion, is just a complete, it would not have happened. She has been a very strong asset for them for the last decade, if not more. So in my opinion, she's just running for cover at this point, hoping to use this later as an excuse, saying that she was trying to help Taiwan, supposedly. Now, what is the CCP going to do with this? Similar to the red line language that Russia was using with NATO prior to Ukraine, and then NATO supposedly crossing this red line, and so Russia used that as an excuse to go ahead and invade Ukraine. Similar to this, I expect the CCP to use this supposed red line that they drew in the sand for Pelosi not visiting Taiwan. I expect them to use this to invade Taiwan at some point. Now, it's actually looking like that will be fairly soon, just based on the progression of moving all of these troops and missiles and tanks and weapons to the Taiwanese Strait. It's a pretty massive move that is currently going on. Of course, the U.S. military strongly discouraged Pelosi from doing this trip. You'll remember they strongly discouraged Biden from withdrawing all of the troops out of Afghanistan. We saw how that went. But I will dive in now to a little bit of China's long-term preparation for this, because it really has been a long build-up to what is now likely going to play out pretty soon from here. So for the last year, if not more than that, China was stockpiling food, and if estimates are correct, China actually has 60% of all of the world's grain and non-perishable food at this point. That's over half of all of the world's reserves of grain, food, etc. So they were preparing to feed their 1.4 billion people for quite a lot of time off of very low, if zero, imports of grain from the U.S. and other trade partners that had formerly been giving them large quantities of grain. So they've been preparing for this for a long time in terms of stockpiling food. They've also been stockpiling energy like never before from Russia. You'll recall that Biden actually sold China a lot of our strategic oil reserves, just another nail in the coffin for him being an asset of the CCP right there. But he did that very recently. Of course, it got brushed under the rug. No one was really talking about it. So, China's been stockpiling energy. U.S. has been losing strategic reserve energy to China. So basically, they've been planning for this for quite some time. The pandemic was likely even just the beginning of that, with them shutting down all of their factories that were going, and then converting some of them, what appears to be now converting them into weapon manufacturers and a more war-related manufacturing, rather than just manufacturing all the crap that they were shipping over for Walmart and Costco and everything. So what likely happens from here, in my opinion, unfortunately, I just see everything pointing in the direction of China eventually declaring war on Taiwan, eventually invading Taiwan. They will use Pelosi's trip to Taiwan as an excuse to do so. Of course, it's similarly just a talking point similar to what Vladimir Putin used on NATO, supposedly talking with Ukraine to invade Ukraine. And at this point, Russia and China are combining forces. So China has actually been assisting Russia in Ukraine very recently, putting a very small proportion of their troops over in Ukraine. So unfortunately for Ukraine as well, I don't see that playing out well for NATO, for Europe, for the United States. I do see the Ukraine conflict continuing to escalate from here, as China and Russia are effectively joining forces. Economically, they've definitely been joining forces as well, growing their trade ties with the other BRICS nations as well, though not quite as closely. They have, in fact, been really discussing starting a new means of exchange, basically a basket of currencies, combining all of their currencies into a basket, using that to trade among themselves. So getting out of the US dollar reserve currency system. So economically, that's a big shift. That means that they will no longer be buying treasuries. In fact, they could be dumping treasuries, and that would in fact be something to expect them to do if they do want to further cripple the US and the US economy, is they would then begin dumping US treasuries. Dollars would begin flooding back into the US, and then inflation would ensue from there in the United States with the dollar. Now, with Russia and Ukraine, the dollar has been somewhat of a safe haven asset. However, with China, Taiwan, I expect that to somewhat go away. So because of the US being drawn significantly more into the conflict between China, Taiwan than Russia, Ukraine, the dollar does stand to fall significantly from where it currently is. What replaces it as a safe haven asset is likely more physical, tangible assets. Gold and silver definitely comes to mind. Perhaps real estate, definitely something like farmland. So what's particularly troubling about China and Taiwan is it cripples the US supply chains like never before, basically. The supply chain would be dysfunctional, if not non-existent at that point. Reshoring would have to be done in a major way. So commodities in the US, whether it's oil, natural gas, copper, steel, would all go up massively in price, simply because of the massive demand, domestic demand that would be drastically increased from there. So basically, it does appear at this point that Ukraine was somewhat of a test, if you will compare it to that, a test of NATO and the U.S. response. Basically seeing, okay, if we push the boundary here, if we invade Ukraine, this in the case of Russia going first here, how will the U.S., how will NATO respond? Now with China and Taiwan, I do expect the U.S. to be much more involved with that, sending significant support to Taiwan, if not outright sending our own military there. So the U.S. would be much more involved there. Obviously, the Federal Reserve would then have a massive excuse to pivot from their tightening cycle. I've been talking about how they already will be pivoting here very soon. Simply, the bond market already has been pivoting, lowering rates again. So basically, the Fed would have very little reason to continue their tightening program, and if anything, Congress and everybody in government would want them to go back into a massive easing cycle so that they could fund all of the war efforts in Taiwan, defending Taiwan. Basically, the supply chains would be severely impacted. The dollar would be severely impacted. Not to mention the U.S. equity prices would be extremely impacted from something like this. So the U.S. economy would basically be in a place of survival, trying to exist without the former most important importer who then turned into our enemy. So unfortunately, that would be a massive impact for the U.S. economy. Reshoring would be the name of the game. It would be where all of the spending would likely go to, or a significant proportion of it would be going into reshoring our supply chains and producing weaponry and other types of commodities which haven't been produced in large quantities for quite some time in the United States. Obviously, hopefully none of this actually happens. I hope that China and Taiwan can reach some sort of agreement. And of course, I hope that no nuclear weapons are involved in this conflict whatsoever. Although, US, China, Russia are all nuclear, armed with nuclear weapons. So unfortunately, it very could well escalate into that. Of course, there's always the loose, unknowns with anything like this. Iran and Israel, they've always been at odds. Iran could choose to act at this time as well, since the U.S. is already compromised, similar with North Korea and perhaps South Korea and Japan. And North Korea has always been very unpredictable in their actions, so there's so many wild cards that could surface out of something like this happening. When Russia did start acting against Ukraine, it was likely only the beginning of a long series of enemies acting against our allies, who they had wanted to do, which they had wanted to do for quite some time. So, unfortunately, a lot of this could continue to escalate from here. Let's say China does invade Taiwan. Russia could then further try to invade more, Georgia, maybe Kazakhstan. At worst, I'm obviously playing out a worst case scenario here, but it just basically could continue to escalate from there, as they would see the U.S. would already be compromised. So obviously, I'm hoping that none of this actually happens, but just putting this out on your guys' radar right now. Unfortunately, this did, there were the indications that this would happen for quite some time, for at least the last year, if not the last 2.5 years since the pandemic, or if you want to call it a plandemic, because it did originate from China. The CCP was very likely involved with the supposed leak or release of this contagion. So all of this being said, there's a lot that I just mentioned here, but if you guys have any comments about this, China invading Taiwan or anything related to that, just put them down in the comment section below. If you liked this video, just consider giving it a thumbs up and subscribing to this channel, and I hope to see you all again at some point.